Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. Now this week's a little bit different because I'm not covering an unsolved disappearance or a gruesome murder. I'm covering a television hacking, but it's probably the creepiest thing I have ever covered on this channel. Like, genuinely, this is the only thing I've ever covered that's actually given me a nightmare, and you'll soon find out why. But before I get into the story, I just want to give a huge thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this week's video. As you know, I am a huge advocate for learning and knowledge on this channel. It's something I feel really passionate about, and Skillshare is an online learning community that offers over 25,000 different classes in pretty much anything you can think of. Photography, business skills, design, cooking, language learning, it's all on there and more. Personally, I've been taking 3-minute Spanish classes, which shockingly are bite-sized 3-minute long Spanish classes that teach you the building blocks of Spanish. But as you go through, it takes these really simple skills that you learnt right at the beginning and show you how these transfer into the more complex levels of the language. Before you know it, you can speak and understand these really complex sentences without even really realising that you're at that level. I just really like how it teaches you the building blocks of the language, and it's all very transferable. I've really liked this lesson because the short classes have meant that I've been able to just fit in as and when I can in my very busy schedule. So whenever I just have a few minutes free, I think, you know what, I'm going to do a couple of lessons, and before you know it, I've learned a whole new word and a whole new sentence structure, and it's brilliant. I've also been learning how to cook with confidence, which I think everyone around me is very grateful for. Skillshare have offered to give away a free 2-month full access trial to anyone who clicks the link in the description down below. It'll be the first line of the description. And then after the free 2 months, it's just $10 a month or £7, which is very reasonable for the amount of things you can learn. Like I said, it's something I feel really passionate about. I think everyone should be constantly trying to better themselves and constantly giving themselves more knowledge, and Skillshare is wonderful for that. And with that, let's get on with the story. And now we'll start our story, which begins on 22nd November 1987 in Chicago, where sportscaster Dan Roan is live on Channel 9 on the news talking about the Chicago Bears' recent victory over the Detroit Lions. And then at 9:14 p.m, Dan Roan disappears from the TV screen. It goes blank for about 15 seconds as the signal gets hijacked and a strange sight appears on the TVs of every single person who is watching the sports news. It's a man dressed in a suit wearing a Max Headroom mask, moving around very strangely in front of what appeared to be a piece of corrugated iron, corrugated metal. Now if you're younger like me, you're probably wondering who the hell Max Headroom is. Now Max Headroom was actually a fictional artificial intelligence TV character. He was sort of like promoted as the world's first computer generated TV host. From what I can gather, he was kind of meant to make fun of the usual insincere, arrogant male TV hosts that would be on everyone's TVs day in, day out. Max Headroom originally appeared in a British TV movie before going on to be in the Max Headroom show in the UK, and finally a dramatic TV series called Max Headroom that aired in the USA. He's a very weird character from what I can gather. I think that me not being a child of the 80s, I just don't really get it. But apparently in the 80s, Max Headroom was incredibly popular. The show Max Headroom broadcast in the USA between 1987 and 1988. And he didn't just appear in these TV shows, he would make cameos in other TV shows, movies. He was even the spokesman, the face of the new Coke, which is basically a reformulation of Coke in the 80s. And Max Headroom was the face of all of that. He was in the advert on TV saying the slogan, "Catch the wave." So this weird guy in the Max Headroom mask appears on the TVs of people across Chicago for about 30 seconds before the people in the control room at WGN-TV manage to flip the signal back. It flips back to Dan Roan, who is sat at his desk looking completely bemused. He says, "Well, if you're wondering what has happened, so am I." Now I'm going to insert a clip of this 30-second intrusion now. Be warned, it's very creepy. I personally find it really creepy anyway. I do not like it.
Well, if you're wondering what happened.
Everything about this intrusion kind of simulated the character of Max Headroom, except it was clearly on a budget and it was just plain weird. But after the signal just flips back to Dan, he resumes his scheduled broadcast. He's just a little bit more confused than he was before, and the rest of the news show goes on without a hitch. Studio engineers working that night assume that it was a hijack by somebody who worked inside the building, so they immediately start searching the building high and low for this masked intruder, but they don't find anyone. But this wasn't the last time the people of Chicago would see Max Headroom that night. It was around 11:15 p.m. during a very popular Doctor Who broadcast on the WTTW channel, Channel 11. The signal was hijacked once again by the same person. This time the broadcast is interrupted by some television static before the same person in the same very creepy Max Headroom mask appears on screen again. But this time there's audio, and it is actually very difficult to decipher what the person is saying. I'll play this one for you now. It's a lot longer than hijacking 2 hours earlier.
You should talk often with the old ones of your tribe. That is the only way to learn.
I'll get you a hot drink, miss.
Some dry clothing.
As far as I can tell, a massive electric shock. He died instantly.
The generator? Were you always so careful?
So yeah, it's just a little bit weird, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable to watch for reasons I can't quite put into words. In this intrusion, he actually makes reference to the New Coke advert featuring Max Headroom. He's actually holding onto a Pepsi can and says the New Coke slogan, "Catch the wave." And he also makes references to the Max Headroom TV series. He's singing songs, he holds up a gardening glove, he's complaining about his piles, I think, at some point from what I could hear. And then suddenly, as you saw, the picture cuts to just a shot of the man's torso with his butt partially exposed. And he's joined by somebody wearing a French maid costume. From watching the tape, I personally believe that this other person is a female, but I suppose that's up to interpretation. And then she starts spanking him with a fly swatter. And then thankfully the signal cuts, the screen goes black for a few seconds, and it returns back to Doctor Who. This hijack all in all lasted about 90 seconds, and the fact that the picture changed suddenly from a face shot of Max Headroom to the torso and the spanking and all of that shows that somebody had pre-filmed this. This wasn't a live broadcast somebody put out. This was pre-filmed and then sent out. Just imagine being a viewer sat at home wanting to watch your weekly episode of Doctor Who, which was one of the most popular TV shows at the time, and then this appears. Some people even thought it was part of the episode. And of course, this was a time before social media, before you could immediately contact people, so a lot of people thought that this was a message sent just to them, just appearing on their TV, maybe part of an alien invasion. Like, people genuinely thought that. Now, the reason the second hijacking was allowed to broadcast for so long, for 90 seconds, was because it was so late at night and there were no engineers on duty at the Sears Tower where the WTTW transmitter was located. Technicians at the WTTW headquarters could see what was going on, but that wasn't located at the Sears Tower. and there was just nothing they could do about it. They couldn't do anything from the headquarters. You had to be at the tower to cut off the signal. But by the time people had actually started looking into it properly, the broadcast was over and the regularly scheduled programming resumed. But since there was nobody on duty during the transmission, they actually had no recordings. WTTW had no recordings of what had happened. So they had to rely on the public who had been recording Doctor Who to hand over their tapes. Both WGN-TV and WTTW received numerous calls from the public wondering what on earth had happened. Some viewers found it really funny, some were just confused, and some were downright furious that they'd missed 90 seconds of Doctor Who. A WTTW spokesman said, "All in all, there are some who may view this as comical, but it's a very serious matter because illegal interference with a broadcast signal is a violation of federal law." And the government, shockingly, also didn't find it particularly funny. The FCC, which stands for the Federal Communications Commission, and it's the agency that regulates the airwaves, dedicated quite a lot of time to finding the hacker. Probably not as much as they should have done, but they dedicated quite a lot of time nonetheless. And a FCC spokesman said, "I would like to inform anyone involved in this kind of thing that there's a maximum penalty of $100,000 and 1 year in jail. Or both." But at the end of the day, it wasn't the kind of incident where anyone died. Nobody got hurt, there was no damage done. This Max Headroom guy wasn't a danger to public safety. And so the government didn't actually bother placing that many resources on the investigation. Eventually, the case just slowed down and went completely quiet. And broadcast intrusions weren't exactly rare in the 80s either. The reason this one is still talked about today is because it's so strange. It had no sort of decipherable message behind it, no politics. It was just plain weird. But it happened quite a lot in the 80s with analog signals. It's actually very possible that in the 80s, anybody with the knowledge or the money or the time on their hands could have done this. With the end of analog signals nowadays and the conversion to pretty much all digital signals, it's more difficult to stage broadcast intrusions nowadays. But it's not actually impossible. I found out in 2007 somebody actually hacked into the Disney Channel and started showing scenes from adult movies. That's right. But are you ready to get technical and find out how easy this could have been in 1987? And by technical, I mean still simple enough that I can understand it. Right, so in very layman's terms, very simple, easy to understand, to spread their signals across the city, local TV networks would relay their signals from their studio to high-power transmitters on top of tall buildings throughout the city. This was done through something called the STL, the Signal Transmission Link. So the signal would go from the studio to these transmitters, which would then send out to TVs across the city. In the case of the Max Headroom intrusion, the transmitters would have been on top of the John Hancock building for the WGN TV, and the Sears Tower for WTTW. So technically, in order to pull off what they did, the hackers would have had to have found a high location at a point in between the TV studios and their transmitters on top of these tall buildings. And they would have also had to have been at a very high point in the city, most likely on a rooftop somewhere or in a very high-rise apartment. From there, they could blast the receivers with their own high-powered signals and override the signals of the studio. And because they would have been at a closer point to the transmitters than the studios were, smack bang most likely in the middle, their signals would have naturally been a lot stronger than that of the studios. I mean, all in all, it sounds quite simple. If you're in the middle, you're going to block the signals coming from the studio and you're going to send out your own, which are a lot stronger, and therefore that's going to be what gets broadcast instead of the studios. It sounds simple, and it probably is if you have the knowledge to do it. And the investigators doubted that the hacker, or hackers I should say, as there was clearly more than one person involved in this, were using expensive high-tech equipment. If they'd bought this equipment new, then it would have cost thousands and thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. But this would have been easily traced. But there's actually a multitude of technology needed for this available in the second-hand market, a lot cheaper, and that makes it almost impossible to track. How do you track things being sold second-hand? They were likely using old second-hand equipment that had been around for many years, but this also meant that they would have had to have known the kind of people to go to buy this kind of equipment. I mean, whoever did this was clearly some kind of techie person. You have to be a techie person to have the know-how, how to do this in the first place, and therefore they would have known other techie people who are likely in the same industry selling these kinds of things. The spilling backdrop of the video was also quite telling for investigators. They said it should have been some kind of industrial metal sheet, probably about 8 foot wide. Some speculate there may have been a roll down warehouse door, which kind of significantly narrows down where exactly they could have done this hijacking. Just look for places that have roll down warehouse doors. But there's also the chance it's not a roll down warehouse door and it's just a big piece of corrugated metal. But if it is a big piece of corrugated metal, whoever did this would have had to have transported the corrugated metal to this location somehow, and that's not exactly something you do without being spotted by someone. You'd notice somebody walking down the street with a 8 foot wide piece of metal. And it wouldn't only be the metal either, it's all of the individual items, the technology needed to do this broadcast, all must have been put in a van and taken somewhere or carried down the street. Somebody must have seen something. I mean, they would have been at the top of a very, very high building. Being in Chicago, there's a lot of very high buildings, and nobody's ever come forward saying they saw anybody with this kind of stuff, which does make me think that maybe it was some kind of more abandoned building, a very quiet building, something along those lines. The investigators did manage to narrow the potential location down to somewhere in north or northwest Chicago, which was the areas between the studios and the transmitters. But Chicago's a pretty big city and they couldn't really narrow it down much more than that. Because at the end of the day, the investigation just wasn't given the budget to investigate this to its full extent, because like I said, nobody died, nobody was hurt, it was likely it wasn't going to happen again, so why would they put all of this money into it when there's other things they could be spending that money on? And this wasn't the usual kind of thing that the FCC had to deal with. The investigator who was actually left in charge of this case was actually too timid to go around and start knocking on doors asking people if they'd seen anything for information, which is what usually investigators would do. But this wasn't the kind of thing the FCC ever had to do. So because the investigator was just a little bit shy to go around and start knocking on doors, it actually just died out eventually. I do truly believe that if a higher budget had been assigned to this case, then they would have been able to solve it pretty quickly. It doesn't seem to me like it would be something that would be that hard to solve. You just have to narrow it down. There's only a certain number of buildings in the city and a certain number of people who would possess the knowledge to be able to do this. But like I mentioned before, nobody came to any harm, so it was just left to become the mystery that it is today. But let's speculate a little bit ourselves. I think there are 3 different possible motives as to why somebody would have wanted to do this. The first one is that it was somebody who had been scorned by the TV stations, maybe a former employee, maybe a relative of a former employee, somebody who was just pissed at the stations, knew how to annoy them, and decided to hijack. The second is that it could have just been some tech nerd who was interested in this kind of thing and just wanted to see if it was possible, knowing they'd get in trouble if they were caught. They wear the Max Headroom mask, they don't particularly have anything to say or anything to do. They just want to see if they can, and they could. And the third is that somebody was really, really pissed that Max Headroom was being taken off the air. As far as I could gather, it was announced in 1987 that the TV show was going to be taken off air, but there were more episodes that were going to be shown in 1988, but I couldn't sort of discover that for certain. I'm not 100% sure on that. Whoever did this was probably just bored with too much time to spare, too much money to spare, or else they already had all this equipment, which could very much narrow it down as to who this could be, which kind of person would have the equipment available to do this. The strangest thing to me is this all would have had to have been planned for weeks beforehand. Like, they would have had to have known what they're doing, figure out a location, figure out how they're going to make this happen. But the actual broadcast had no message behind it whatsoever. It was just incoherent, babbling, very, very creepy, very, very weird. Why? I mean, a lot of people do these intrusions when they have a political message to share or something that they want to get out of there. But there just didn't seem to be that in this case. And this was pre-recorded as well. They had recorded this, obviously watched it back and thought, yes, this is exactly what I want to be sending out. To me, it seems like the first intrusion was just the practice round, and the intrusion during Doctor Who was their like main one. That was the audience that they wanted to target in this, which kind of makes sense because Max Headroom was kind of like sci-fi, Doctor Who's sci-fi. it just seems to work. I mean, they would have known how popular Doctor Who was, how many people would have been recording it, and it seems likely that they probably would have known that at that time at night, at 11:15, there wouldn't have been any technicians at the Sears Tower. Either they got very, very lucky with that, or they knew that would be the case, in which case it seems like it would have been somebody who had previously worked at the TV stations. At the end of the day, bar some sort of deathbed confession, I don't think this case is ever going to be solved. The statute of limitations ran out on it years ago, and so if the people responsible were to come forward now, they wouldn't have any repercussions for it whatsoever. They'd get in absolutely no trouble. But they haven't, and they probably haven't because they don't ever intend to. This is one of those cases that will probably go down better in history as this very strange thing that happened, this very strange unsolved case. If the people responsible were to come forward, they'll probably have a day or two in the limelight, and then people would forget about it and it would probably never be talked about again. It kind of seems like if they want the notoriety of this, then they get more notoriety by not coming forward. Regardless, there's definitely more than one person who knows what happened here, and the fact that nobody's ever come forward and spilled the beans is kind of incredible. The only reason I'd particularly want this case to be solved is because I think I'd find it a lot less creepy if I knew the face behind the mask. And also I'd love to find out why they did it, because it was just so strange. And with that, we'll draw this one to a close. I know this mystery was a little bit different, but I've been wanting to cover it for ages, and this just kind of seemed like the perfect week to do it. Don't forget to check out Skillshare in the description box down below. First 500 people will get a free 2-month trial. It's definitely worth trying out if you want to learn some new skills. Make sure you subscribe to my channel. There's a new midweek mystery video every single Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and leave your comments down below. I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.